have there are 4 people populated already. Welcome to the LionSide Chats. We'll be getting started in about 45 seconds. Excuse me.
Hi. We're asking people to check in by scanning one of these things.
Should we leave one of the doors propped a little bit so
Probably not.
that, no,
No.
I just wasn't sure.
I don't think we can, actually. Yeah, but I'll check. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the LionSide Chat Haas Colloquium collaboration. We are live streaming here from Franco 157. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Keisha Morant-Williams to introduce our speaker today.
So today we have for our first Haas Colloquium of the semester, Dr. Randall Newnham, who is a professor of political science here at Penn State Berks. His research focuses on the role of economic aid and sanctions as foreign policy tools. Dr. Newnham teaches introductory courses in international relations, comparative politics, and American government. He also teaches advanced courses on the rise and fall of the Soviet Union and international political economy. Today, he'll be discussing vaccine diplomacy.
Thanks very much. And thanks to those of you who are joining us here in person, as well as the online audience. Hi, hi out there in cyberspace. So my theme today, everybody knows COVID-19, of course, has changed the world. As you can tell, I'm delivering this talk in a mask, of course, which wouldn't have taken place 18 months ago. So the world has changed. You'd expect international relations has changed too, or has it? My theme is not as much as you think. So these new COVID vaccines that I'm going to be talking about here have become just another way for countries to compete with each other and a new instrument that they can use for power games with each other, trying to influence other countries. And you might say to yourself, you know, how horrible, how can something as wonderful and life-saving as a COVID vaccine be used that way? Well, my theme is that's always the case in international relations. And the literature that I looked at for this, you know, in social sciences papers, we've always got to look at the past literature and what is the theory you're using. And I looked at some of the earlier work that I've done on economic sanctions, economic aid, and how countries have used money to influence other countries. And I found this is pretty similar. In particular, there's a good comparison to the economic aid and developmental aid that countries were giving during the time of the Cold War. And I see a lot of the same things happening here, where there's several things that look similar. For example, number one, if you're a country giving out aid to other countries, you want to try to give it directly to them. It's bilateral aid, we call that, rather than like giving it to the United Nations and let them give it out. You want to give it directly to the country. Why? So you can influence that country. I'm giving you this aid, what are you giving me? Is kind of the overall theme. So try to single out the country that you're targeting. You want to give aid to your friends. That's what countries did in the Cold War, and that's what they're still doing now. In this case with vaccines, you give aid to your friends, which what we call positive linkage in political science, giving them stuff in return for them making concessions to you. And at the same time, you deny aid to your enemies. That's what we call negative linkage, like an economic sanction or embargo. But again, you're trying to influence them. You're making the point, hey, if you'll be nice to me, you'll get the goodies, you know. And finally, you face a question of how strong should the strings be on this aid? You know, the phrase strings are attached. There's always strings attached, but I see two different methods. First of all, what I call specific linkage means you are saying to the country, you don't get the vaccine until you do this. That's pretty clear. But then the other form of linkage, which is softer, is you say to the country, well, you're my friend, so I'm going to give you this aid. But there's still a string attached. There's still the implication of you better stay my friend. I'm going to ask you for a favor eventually, just not directly linked to this immediate aid that I'm giving. And so you see all of this taking place with a bunch of countries around the world right now. In the last year, as the COVID vaccines have rolled out, every country that's been a significant COVID vaccine producer has been doing this. Some more openly than others, some more with more of this, direct strings attached aid than others, but still, clearly there's linkage going on. Oh, good. We have somebody else coming in. I see somebody from one of my classes. Good. So some of the current cases that I'm looking at, as I've gone over these different countries that are giving vaccine and how they're using that vaccine as a tool. I put a few up here on the board. I hope people can see. So first, Russia. I'm going to go through a little bit on Russia, China, Israel, India, and the United States, all of which are countries that in the last year have been using their vaccine to try to influence other countries. And it's interesting to see, by the way, look who's here. Not always the countries that you would think of as the big world powers. This may have scrambled the world power game a little bit, because now it's about, do you have vaccines to give? And that's not always the biggest countries. It could be just a country that happens to have a good medical industry. So it's kind of, it creates a new world order a little bit of vaccine-rich countries. So Russia first a little bit. I put Russia first because they came up with the first vaccine called Sputnik 5, as I put here. And they, by the way, named it very deliberately that after the famous Sputnik spacecraft from the 1950s that was a huge breakthrough for Russian science that the whole world noticed. And they want to say this is the same thing. We're creating this new breakthrough to save the world. So they have thrown a lot of propaganda behind this, by the way, because they really wanted to make Russia look good, to make their technology look advanced, to make them look generous. Here we're providing this vaccine to the world, and we got it out so wonderfully early. They actually approved it in Russia last August 11th, 2020. So only like 6 months after well, 8 months after the epidemic really kicked off. However, they did that by really cutting corners on the approval process and rushing it into production, which made a lot of countries suspicious. So they have used their propaganda apparatus to really push, this is a wonderful vaccine, it has no side effects whatsoever, despite giving no evidence of that, and so on. However, they've also used their propaganda to attack other countries' vaccines, which is much more negative. Attacking Western vaccines in particular, claiming that they have side effects, that they aren't working, and so on. So this misinformation that they've been throwing around is very dangerous, and it's a big source for the misinformation here in the United States on the vaccine. In any case, how Russia has used this vaccine, they've used both the more general kind of linkage, just give it to your friends, and the more specific kind of linkage, let's use it for a targeted political purpose. For example, on the more general side, giving vaccine to countries like Syria, which has been a big client of Russia. And other countries that are their allies, like Belarus, Armenia, countries that have been close to Russia, either giving it to them or even just by offering to sell it to them. That's a huge favor, because remember, this is so early, no other country is offering a vaccine. And if I'll even offer to sell it to you, that is a huge favor. But they've also been using it a little more in a more sinister way, kind of a divide and conquer strategy, targeting their enemies, particularly clear with the European Union. Russia sees the European Union as an enemy, a rival for control in Eastern Europe especially. But the European Union is very legalistic. They demanded very careful vetting of the vaccine before they would admit it to the European Union. They didn't want a rushed vaccine. And the Russians just refused. The Russians were like, no, we think it's good enough. They didn't want to wait for the months and months of testing. They didn't finally get a positive result on their stage 3 testing until February 2021, 6 months after they started selling this all around the world. But Russia still was offering this to European countries, trying to tempt them into buying the Russian vaccine, even though the European Union had not approved it yet. So that created a real dilemma for these countries, because of course, as I said, at the time, there's no other vaccine. So what are you going to do? And some of the countries in the European Union fell for that temptation and did buy the Russian vaccine, and then got in big trouble with the other European Union countries. So dividing the EU was a big strategy for them. So countries like Hungary and Serbia took big deliveries of the Russian vaccine, and then that angered their neighbors. Places like the Czech Republic and Croatia that were trying to play by the rules. And here there's vaccine being offered right next door. And that makes your government look bad. And the Russians, of course, were saying the European Union won't let us give out this vaccine. They're being bad. They're denying this vaccine just because they hate Russia, which was a total lie. But it was very effective propaganda. And at the time, it made us look pretty bad and made Western Europe look pretty bad. Because here the Russians are providing this vaccine, and we've got nothing. America and Western Europe still did not have a vaccine approved. So we were kind of helpless. And all around the world, places like Africa, for example, the Russians were going out saying, we've got vaccine for you poor people, love us, you know, and the West had no real response. China did a kind of similar thing. They were a little slower than the Russians, but only by a few months. Already by the winter of 2020, 2021, they had 2 vaccines ready to go, called Sinovac and Sinopharm. And they too were very eager to give these to their geopolitical friends. Cambodia, for example, is a country that's very close to China, also a very poor country. And the Russians gave them a bunch of vaccine, also sold them some cheaply. And next thing you know, Cambodia has vaccination rates that are the highest in Southeast Asia, higher than places like Singapore for a while. So making the point, hey, if you're a friend of China, look what you get. So there was that kind of general linkage that I talked about. And just also worldwide, like the Russians, they wanted to make themselves look good and make us look bad. They were very specific about saying America is hoarding vaccines. Western Europe is hoarding vaccines. They're keeping them all for themselves. They don't want you to have any. And again, that was effective propaganda for at least a few months. Well, we were behind on getting the vaccines out there because first of all, we had a more complicated regulatory process. We wanted to make sure they were safe and effective. Secondly, we wanted to supply our own country first, which Russia and China didn't bother to do. Russia and China started rushing doses out around the world to make foreign policy gains while their own people were hardly vaccinated at all. Not something you can do so much in a democracy. But China also, like Russia, had some specific goals that they were trying to pursue to achieve their foreign policy points. So, for example, a big priority was to target Taiwan. Taiwan, you know, is an island off of China with its own government, and China, mainland China, has wanted to get Taiwan back for a long time. So what they did was they effectively put a vaccine blockade on Taiwan. They very cleverly, a Chinese company, a mainland Chinese company, was able to get the production rights for the main Western vaccine at the time, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and they were able to get that production right for China and Taiwan. So Taiwan had no right to buy that vaccine directly from Pfizer or the German BioNTech. They had to buy it through mainland China, which they didn't want to do because, of course, then the mainland Chinese are holding this over them. They tried to buy directly from the Western suppliers, but the licensing agreement didn't allow that. So that was very clever. So they blockaded Taiwan itself, denying them vaccines. And then they targeted countries around the world because there's been a diplomatic battle going on between Taiwan and mainland China for decades over who is the real China. And there are still about 15 countries that say Taiwan is the real China, not mainland China. They're mostly very small countries, and Taiwan has gotten them to keep their diplomatic recognition of Taiwan mainly by giving them money. These little third world countries, and you give them a few $1 million a year, they're happy to keep their embassy in Taiwan instead of in mainland China. Well, China turned the tables on because China now has these vaccines. And China could say to these countries, so you still want to have diplomatic ties with Taiwan, eh? You're not getting any vaccine from us. But if you do switch to us, look at all the vaccine. So the first thing they did was to use kind of positive linkage, sending lots of doses to the countries who switched. And there are several countries that had already switched right before the vaccine came out, because China has been using this money too to influence them. So Panama, El Salvador, and the Dominican Republic, for example, in the Americas had just switched to mainland China, and they got millions of doses all of a sudden. Meanwhile, a couple of other countries, Honduras and Paraguay, who were still with Taiwan, they were feeling the pressure. Here, their neighbors are getting all these vaccines, their people are dying, and China says, so, want to move your embassy? I mean, really, who cares about an embassy when your people are dying? So both Honduras and Paraguay were starting to buckle. We're saying maybe we should do this. Maybe we should cut a deal with China. And that was very bad for Taiwan. So that was one objective, target Taiwan. Another objective was to silence the protests that have been taking place over China's human rights record. You know, what they're doing, cracking down in Hong Kong, cracking down in Western China, where the Uyghur people are being arrested, cracking down in Tibet. And some countries have been condemning that. And China made it pretty clear, you condemn our human rights record, no vaccine. There was a pretty dramatic case in June of 2021. Ukraine was desperate to get the vaccine. And the Russians were not giving Ukraine any vaccine because they hate Ukraine. That's one of their enemies. All the countries around them were getting it, but not Ukraine. So the Ukrainians reached out to China, thinking China's got nothing against us. China will send us a few million doses. China agreed to sell them some doses. But then when the doses started to arrive, Ukraine was signing a letter at the United Nations condemning China's human rights record. And China said, no more doses for you unless you retract that signature. Within 2 days, they retracted their signature, saying we will not protest your human rights record, and the vaccine started again. So, you know, that kind of crackdown is something you can do when you've got a life-saving thing that you can hold over people's heads. Finally, a third thing China has done, another big controversy you might be aware of around the world that China's involved in is the technical question of who's going to deliver the world's 5G networks. And China is pushing a company called Huawei, which some of you maybe have heard about this. Huawei a big Chinese telecom company very close to the Chinese government, and they want countries around the world to use this technology for 5G. United States does not want countries to use that. They claim that this could be used by China for spying and so on. Well, countries that get Chinese vaccines seem to have a habit of saying, okay, Huawei. Notably, Brazil did this. Brazil is a very right-wing country at the moment. Their president is called the Trump of South America, very close friends with Trump. And he said for years, we will not use the Chinese system because we think it's a Chinese plot. They're going to be spying on us. Then all of a sudden, when Brazil needed vaccines, the Brazilian minister in charge of telecom went to Huawei and said to them, please help us get vaccines. It's pretty obvious what the implication is there, right? And then all of a sudden, Huawei is okay for Brazil. So, you know, China has really used this linkage with some effectiveness. However, both Russia and China have fallen behind a little bit lately because both of them rushed their vaccines out so much. So there's really questions about the safety and efficacy of their vaccines compared to the Western ones. I mentioned how Russia, for so many months, didn't really give the data to prove anything. We think we have decent data on the Russian one now. It seems to be pretty much okay. But the Chinese ones have proven to have pretty low effectiveness, especially against Delta. And in a lot of the countries that use the Chinese ones, they're finding they still get a ton of COVID cases. And many people in those countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Seychelles, United Arab Emirates, several of these countries have said, wait a minute, we want to revaccinate with the good vaccines from the West. So that has hurt China's image a little bit. These other countries, briefly, you might say to yourself, you know, how on earth does Israel get to be the vaccine superpower? They're a small country. How can they have this influence? Well, what they did that was very clever was they bought a lot of extra doses. They ordered very early from Pfizer and Moderna. They got delivery very quickly. They were able to vaccinate most of their people, and then they still had a lot left. Whereas around the world, countries were desperate. So they realized that gave them some leverage. So what they cleverly did was they gave small targeted donations to some countries. Literally only 5,000 doses. Here's 5,000 doses for the Czech Republic. Here's 5,000 doses for Romania. I mean, that's nothing. But remember, at the time, this is like maybe February of this year, countries are desperate. They've got nothing. So even a plane showing up with 5,000 doses is like, you know, bring out the brass band, yay for Israel. The Israeli ambassador will come. It's on all the national TV networks, very effective propaganda. And who did they target? They targeted countries who would recognize Israel. Like China, we can use this for diplomatic gain. And you know, there's a lot of countries around the world, especially in the Arab world, who don't recognize Israel as a state. But if you do, you get vaccines. Or another tactic is, I don't know if you've heard about this debate, but Israel's official capital is Jerusalem. And a lot of countries are reluctant to put their embassy in Jerusalem because the Palestinians claim part of Jerusalem for their eventual capital. So a lot of embassies in Israel were still in Tel Aviv, a different, larger city, not in Jerusalem. And that was another tactic they used. If you move your embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, you get vaccines. So they targeted something like 20 countries with small donations in early 2021, rewarding these friends who had done what Israel wanted. Another thing they did that was very direct use of vaccine as a power tool was they had a hostage taken in Syria. A rather confused, maybe mentally ill Israeli woman wandered across the border into Syria, which is a deadly enemy of Israel, and was taken captive. Israel wanted her back. So the Russians stepped in. Remember, they're a good friend of Syria. The Russians stepped in and said, Israel, we will cut a deal between you and Syria. How about this? You, Israel, pay a few $1 million to buy Russian vaccines that we will then give to Syria. So it's win-win for Russia. Actually, win-win-win. Number one, they get influence in Israel. Number two, they supply vaccines to their friend Syria. And number three, they make money off the deal. So that was a very clever tactic by the Russians. And finally, Israel has come up with something really neat lately, which is vaccine lending. You didn't think they could do that, did you? You know? I mean, how do you lend someone vaccines? Because of course, vaccine goes in the arm, it's used. How can you pay it back? Israel had 1 million doses of vaccine extra that were going to run out in a month or so. They have an expiration date. They didn't know what to do with them. So they went shopping around the world to other countries and said, everybody's desperate for this. How about this for a deal? We'll swap you. We'll give you some of our vaccine that's going to run out pretty soon. So you can stick it in people's arms right away. And you promise to give us back your order of vaccine when it comes in a few months later. And then we get fresh vaccine that we can use for years afterwards. So again, very clever. Doesn't cost Israel anything. So for example, in July of this year, they gave South Korea 700,000 shots. And South Korea is a pretty wealthy country. They had a lot of Western vaccine coming. So they agreed as soon as theirs comes in, they'll give 700,000 back to Israel. So Israel wins a friend, and it doesn't really cost them anything. It's very similar to in economic aid terms. A lot of times when you're giving aid to a poor country, what countries will do is they'll make it a loan. They won't just give them something, they'll make it a loan. And then you win the goodwill, but then they still have to pay you back. So it's win-win. Anyway, finally, I got one more. India has lost some power in vaccine diplomacy. They were very optimistic a year ago. Now they're trying to come back. They have their own vaccine. I forget the name of it. Maybe you remember. They have their own vaccine that they developed. And they also are known, as is Israel, by the way, they are known as huge generic drug makers. And that gives them a lot of potential vaccine power because as soon as Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson allow it, India can start pumping out huge doses to supply Africa, Middle East, and so on, like they have done with other medicines. So the government of India very much wants that to happen. They did make some donations to try to get political purposes. For example, they've kind of been in a rivalry with China. So they went out to some of the same countries around China and said, well, you're being offered Chinese vaccines. Would you like the Indian vaccine? You know, stay with us, don't go with China. And they also specifically targeted a couple of countries that China was targeting just to get revenge on China. Paraguay, for example, I mentioned was one of the countries that had ties with Taiwan that China was saying, you know, we'll give you a vaccine if you break those ties. Well, India stepped in and sent vaccine to Paraguay to block the Chinese move. So they were doing some of this direct linkage, but they also have offered to donate a lot to the United Nations, a lot of doses, unlike some of the other countries, which might seem to be very generous. Remember how I said at the beginning, usually if you're offering something, you want to keep it just you and the other country. So you get the credit, you owe me, you know? You don't want to do it through the United Nations, then you get no credit. But India was willing to do this because they thought we'll look like the good guys. Everybody in the world will see the Russians, the Chinese, etc. There's strings attached. We're going to give some of the United Nations, look like the good guys, and then people will like India. So there's always strings attached, just in a more subtle way. The problem India had was they had a big surge of COVID. So they had to divert all of their production to within India. And I don't know if they've even stopped doing that yet. They had so many people they had to vaccinate that for months, they had to tell the other countries, sorry, we can't send you the stuff we promised because people were dying in India. So that knocked them out of the game temporarily, at least. Finally, us, United States. We were in some trouble to start with. Up until summer 2021, we were behind. Because remember, I said these other countries got theirs out quickly, and they were going around the world and all kinds of propaganda targeting the United States, saying, yeah, United States not giving out, keeping it for yourself, you know, rich white people grabbing everything for themselves, like colonial powers. We are generously giving it to you. And countries were going along with that because they had no choice. You need vaccine, where are you going to get it from? But then starting in like early summer of 2021, we really started rolling out quantities for overseas. Why? Partly because our own people won't take it anymore. So we had millions of doses ready to go into the arms of Americans who refused it. So we may as well get something out of it and send it overseas. So we started doing that. And we have the advantage of quality. As I mentioned, a couple of these other countries, their rollout was so fast that they got a lot of criticism for not having a good product. And we took longer, but we ended up with a good reputation for quality. So that has helped. And we did end up doing the same thing that India has done, which is we offered a lot of it to the United Nations. They have a program worldwide called COVAX. That's the United Nations vaccine program. And we have offered millions of doses to them. But again, is this just us being nice? Not entirely. It's us wanting to look nice. So countries will say, you know, Russia and China were wrong. You are generous. You are good people. We should go with you politically. But we've also done some strings attached too. For example, we saw what China was doing to Taiwan, and we very specifically said Taiwan were riding to the rescue. We sent US senators to Taiwan with a plane load of vaccine. We got the Japanese to donate a few more plane loads of vaccine. So all of a sudden, Taiwan gets a lot of vaccine, which is very political. Because they're a pretty rich country. They have not had a lot of COVID. Why are you giving it to them instead of some poor country where a lot of people are dying? Because you want to get back in China. You know, we clearly had some political motivations there. We also quickly rushed donations to countries like Honduras and Paraguay, which were being targeted by China as well. And we have sent a lot of doses to the Ukraine, which I mentioned is a country that's been under a lot of attack by the Russians. So we also are not totally innocent here. We are trying to use, our Secretary of State has made a big point of saying, these guys are bad, too many strings attached. COVID should be for helping people. COVID vaccine, should be for helping people, but we've done a little of it too. So, final point here, what can these poor countries do that don't have a vaccine? Their people are dying, they need the vaccine. How are you gonna get it? You can try to get it from the United Nations. That's one solution. Try to make it multilateral rather than having to go crawling to Russia or go crawling to the United States and say, please give us vaccine, get the United Nations to give you some. So that's one thing that the poorer countries have been trying to do. But another clever thing that they can do is play these people off against each other. And this is something also that there's a whole history of. You go back into the Cold War, for example, there were some smart countries that played the Soviet Union and the United States off against each other. And were tried to be friendly with both and tried to get aid from both. Like India did that to some extent, I think. Egypt very definitely did that. They were famous for that. Egypt had a huge dam that they wanted to build across the Nile River called the Aswan High Dam. And they basically switched back and forth between Russia and the US over who would pay for it. Like, how much are you offering us? We'll be your friend. Give us money for the dam. Well, no, maybe we'll go with the Russians. And then that would scare the Americans. Here, this important Middle Eastern country might be going with the Russians. So then the Americans would offer more. So if you're clever about it, you can play them off against each a little bit. And some countries have done that. Interesting example is Mongolia, which you wouldn't think of as a smart or powerful country. Mongolia is located right between Russia and China, and yet they're very independent. And so they were able to go to both Russia and China and say, what are you going to give us for vaccines? So China rushed them several million doses, and Russia rushed them a couple million doses. And next thing you know, by like, I don't know, February or March of 2021, they got like 50% of their people vaccinated, way faster than the United States did. So, you know, if you're smart about it, you can do that kind of thing. And I mentioned a couple of other examples of countries that maybe were going back and forth between China and the US. You know, China is trying to make us do this, so we'll go with the Americans. You know, so there, if you can play your cards right, you can try to get a choice. So you're not just locked into one country pressuring you and making you do something you don't want to do. So overall, though, kind of my big final point is this is really changing the world. So many ways COVID has changed the world, and this is another way. And in this case, vaccine power is going to become something that we study in the future, along with, you know, economic power, military power, and so on. And it looks like it's going to be lasting, because I know, not to disillusion people, but what it looks like is going to happen with COVID at this point is it's going to become like the world's worst flu, where it goes on and on and on with different variants every year. And probably what that means is every year you're going to want to get a booster shot for that year's COVID, which means this is not a one-off thing. If it was just once vaccinate done, then the power is over. But if it's you need a new shot every year, then you're going to have to keep going back to the Russians, and going back to the Chinese, and going back to the Americans, and maybe going back to India or Israel, or Germany with the BioNTech vaccine, or whoever has big vaccine capacity. Every year you're going to have to get a booster from them, which means they've got you on the hook, you know, and your country is going to have to, you know, jump to their tune. Unless you can produce it yourself. And just in the news the other day was that I think it was Pfizer is going to build a big vaccine plant in Africa. And if countries start doing that, you know, that maybe changes the game, because that lets more countries produce it on their own. And therefore they don't need to just be puppets on the other country's strings. But can every country do that? It's not easy to make these vaccines. It's not like you're making bottle caps or something. It takes a lot of technology, and probably a lot of small, poor countries still will not be able to do it themselves. So that'd be interesting to see for the future. Okay, I think that's my main points. Now, Dawn, were you going to call for questions?
I am. I'm going to turn my camera on so those of you that are joining us through Zoom can see that I am here in the room, and then in the back, you see me. I'm going to turn me off now, and I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to facilitate Q&A. I'll alternate questions from the room and from the Zoom. So I will go with a question in the Zoom first, because that one's been there for a minute or two, and then we can go into the room. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. So our first question: is vaccine resistance significant anywhere else in the world like it is in the US?
Really good question. It is. And ironically, some of it is blowback from countries' own propaganda. I mentioned, for example, that the Russians in particular have done a lot of kind of black propaganda against our vaccines. The Chinese have not been quite as bad in that respect. The Chinese have been doing a lot of propaganda, mainly saying how great their vaccines are, but I haven't heard them attacking ours a lot. But the Russians did a lot of attacking of ours and questioning, is COVID even such a big deal? And talking about side effects of vaccines and so on. And unfortunately, that has come back to bite them in the rear, because the Russian people are very vaccine resistant. Even though you've got a government over there, Vladimir Putin, who's pretty harsh, he has not been able to get most of the Russians vaccinated. It's coming up a little bit now, but for a long, long time, the Russians were like, we know everything our government says is propaganda. So now the government has turned around and is urging us to get the vaccine. No, they must be lying to us again. And for a long time, they had vaccine rates of like 10%, 15%. I mean, pathetic compared to even where we are. We're at about, 50, 60% now. And then they found out kind of that maybe that propaganda wasn't such a great idea. But there's been a lot of skepticism around the world. Western Europe also too. They have a lot of the same kind of, what's the effect on our health going to be? What's the long-term effect? People spreading rumors about this or that strange side effect that may or may not be happening. And, it's really a problem in a lot of places. Yeah.
All right, very interesting. Thank you. I do have a question in the room, but just to remind our Zoom audience, please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom function, so you could ask your questions. I won't be calling on folks with raised hands or utilizing the chat. Go ahead.
To respond, the president of Brazil actually spoke out against the vaccines. Brazil's a fairly big place. He spoke out very staunchly that he doesn't believe in anything. But I was wondering, you said it's very hard to make the drugs. Are there generic versions of the drugs being made like every other drug that's going through the system? And are they being made by like other countries? We have a vaccine nationalism, but is it possible that there's like also a Pfizer that's made in China?
Right. Well, there will be, I think. It takes a while to get that going. I mean, you've got a couple of problems. First, you got the technical problems, which is you can't just copy that overnight and get something set up. But second, you've got a lot of kind of political problems, which is you got to persuade the countries that have the vaccines to give them up, to give up that power. And so, you have to persuade the Russians to let other people copy that vaccine and so on. And we've had that dilemma too. We spent billions developing the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. That one is a German-American effort. Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, which has not been used much here in America, but we've sent a lot of doses overseas. Moderna, those were all big, expensive projects. And it's like, do we just give that away? Because normally, how drug companies work. Normally, drug companies want to hold on to that for 7 or 10 years so they can make a lot of money off of it. And then maybe they'll allow a generic version to come out. But in the case of COVID, it's like people are dying all over the world. So there's a lot of pressure to give it up, let the generics come out. And President Biden has even agreed with that now, where he has said we're willing to give up this technology and let others use it. I think the West Europeans are reluctant at this point because, they're giving away such a powerful asset. But I would expect within the next year or two, we'll be seeing that, because there are countries I mentioned also, like India and Israel, who in the past have done a lot of generics, and they really would like to get their hands on that recipe, so they can start cranking out low cost, which helps their political influence in the world and also lets them make some money, because then all these countries in Africa, Asia, etc., can pay India or someone to make the generic version, so that's probably where it's going, But even if we agree to do that, we're not doing it entirely to be nice. You know, there's always strings. So if we do the nice thing and say, okay, we'll let you copy this vaccine, now like us, you know, look how generous we are. I mean, that'll be intentional too, you know, no free lunch.
Thank you. And back to the Zoom.
Yeah.
Some countries have national vaccine producers, but in the West, it's mostly private corporations. What autonomy do pharmaceutical corporations have, and thus how much power do they have now and in the future, especially if corporations like Pfizer are building new plants on their own?
That's a good point. I mean, I've just been talking about the countries, but what if the vaccine producers themselves are able to go out and do some of this? You know, now the countries have a lot of leverage over them, because don't forget, even here in America, you know, private producer, we paid billions to these companies to get the thing made. So they don't really have full ownership of it, because President Biden can always say, look at all the billions we gave you to develop this. But you're right, I mean, they control the technology immediately, so they can start cutting deals. And you can imagine a whole lot of business linkages taking place, you know? Hey, we're Pfizer, we've got this extremely wonderful COVID vaccine, India. Now we'll let you build a factory to produce the COVID vaccine. Now, how much are you gonna pay us for this other Pfizer drug?
Right.
That kind of thing. Or are you gonna give us permission to sell this other Pfizer drug in India? You can envision that kind of stuff happening behind the scenes. I mean, and again, you like to think that they're in it for helping people, but you know, you do this business for a little while, you get kind of cynical.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
In the room, is there another question? Yes, go ahead.
I would like to ask why, I mean, like, I can understand why the countries are making their own vaccines, but why wouldn't the UN make vaccines to pass out to the countries?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it'd be nice if the UN had that capacity. But the UN doesn't have a whole lot of autonomy. I mean, this is something I talk about in my international relations classes. The UN is not its own country.
Yeah.
The UN is just a club of all the countries. So it kind of does what the countries tell it to. So the countries are fine with having the UN be kind of a clearinghouse for their vaccines, but they have not really given them the kind of funding to, you know, make their own vaccines.
Yeah.
But you're right, that they could be like an umbrella perhaps to run production facilities in other places.
Yeah.
Or the World Health Organization could do that. That's an arm of the United Nations.
Instead of using it like politically,
Right.
you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a good idea, but it's like, you know, the people who have a hold of the vaccines don't always want to let them go,
Yeah.
you know, so. You want?
I'm gonna go back out. I have another question in Zoom, and then I'll come back in here.
Okay.
Personally, how do you feel about the evident monopoly effect between nations in such a delicate topic? When they are just thinking of the money that they can make through vaccinations, not how many lives can be saved globally because of that.
Right, yeah, this has been, I mean, this is a huge problem with COVID because literally people are dying. But this has been a problem before with economic aid. You look at, you know, when countries in Africa are having a starvation episode, there still will be countries that will say, well, we're not giving you food aid because we don't like you.
Right.
You know, you're on the wrong side politically, or you voted against us in the United Nations, or you know. So, you know, this kind of thing has happened, and it's morally speaking, you know, it's pretty questionable if you're taking like a Christian perspective or something like that. I mean, Jesus said, you know, feed the hungry and clothe the poor. He didn't say feed the hungry and clothe the poor if they're nice to you or if they do what you told them to, you know, but yeah,
I
that
get you.
seems to be the way it works, you know.
Good.
In the media, a few famous people, and I remember Courtney Love, but a few famous people mentioned that they received the vaccine before there was even any word of having a vaccine. In your interpretations and insights, have you seen any evidence of that being like the case, or, oh, you know, you know, how other countries aren't getting the vaccine, were we considered like a lower country?
Yeah, there's a lot of people that, this will be interesting to see what comes out about this, but there definitely has been some kind of cheating in that way. Because it's a life-saving thing, people want to get their hands on it. I know of some cases, for example, where I think it was Geisinger Medical Center right here in Pennsylvania. They offered a program where they would, of course, vaccinate their medical personnel. That's what those people had first priority. But the way they did it was, we're going to vaccinate all our medical personnel, and each one of you gets to bring a guest. Really? So people could bring in their wife or bring in their kid and get the vaccine for that person months ahead of their normal place in the priority line, just because they happen to be a Geisinger employee. I think they had to stop doing that because there was so much outrage in the community. But you know, that kind of thing happens. Another example has been in South America. You know, the United States was trying to vaccinate its own people first, of course, because we paid for the vaccine. We wanted to save lives here at home. So, you know, all the way from probably December 2020 up until like May 2021, we were not exporting anything because we were trying to vaccinate here. Well, what happens if you're rich enough to get here? And there were a lot of people, especially in South America, which is not that terribly far away, their countries were showing no signs of rolling out the vaccine if you're in Colombia or someplace. But if you've got the money, hop on a plane to Florida and get the vaccine. So thousands of wealthy people from South America did that and got, you know, months ahead, you know, often young, healthy people with no, you know, medical or other reason to get the vaccine, just they had money. So there was a lot of resentment in their home countries at people doing that, but at the same time, it's kind of like you can't blame them. You know, if you've got the opportunity to do that, you know, it's special treatment sometimes. They just had a funny case like that in Hong Kong that caused a lot of outrage. I think it was Nicole Kidman, a big American movie star, was going over to Hong Kong to do a movie. And Hong Kong normally has a very strict quarantine when you arrive. You have to be locked up in a hotel room for at least 2 weeks. But Nicole Kidman, she came off the plane and they said, go ahead and start shooting Nicole. And a lot of people in Hong Kong were like, seriously? You know, I can't even get my own relatives into the country. You're letting Nicole Kidman come in? You know, there's people and then there's special people, I guess.
Yes. I think we have time for maybe 2, maybe 3 more questions, depending.
Okay.
I have one here in the Zoom for you.
Great.
Have you seen any studies comparing the effectiveness of these various vaccines from around the world?
That's a good question, yeah, because those are starting to come out now. I mentioned that especially the Russian and Chinese ones came into production before they were tested very well. Or another problem is who does the studies. And frankly, some of the studies from these countries we don't trust because we say, did you make up the data? We want to do our own study, which is kind of sad, but that's the kind of the distrusting world that we live in. So I have not seen a lot of comparative studies because what tends to happen is the drug makers and the country do a study of their own. And the only comparison would be, okay, our group showed this effectiveness, your group showed that effectiveness. But it would really be a better study if you just did one big study and tested all, you know, which has not really been done yet as far as I know. But in terms of, you know, effectiveness of warding off illness, I believe for the American vaccines, I remember hearing that Pfizer and Moderna initially were being credited with like a 95% warding off illness rate. That has fallen because of Delta variant, somewhat at least. Johnson & Johnson, I think, was originally at something like 80%. The Russian Sputnik also ended up coming in the 90s when they finally got the data on that, which we hope is reliable data. So theirs look pretty good. Sinopharm and Sinovac were only about 50%. So not as impressive. But then there's another problem we've been coping with right now, if you follow the news, which is the waning of these vaccines. That's another thing we need to study. And that's harder because that's over time. So you don't know right away. And it seems like certainly true with our vaccines, probably true with their vaccines too. After 6 months, does the effect start to wear off? And that's why everybody's talking about these boosters. Plus, of course, the variant problem. But even against the original virus, does it slowly wane? And that's worrying. And maybe means you need even more vaccine, So.
Okay, is
Yeah.
there any, one last question here in the room?
It's kind of a follow-up,
Go
but
ahead.
the viruses keep mutating, so the vaccines have to keep up with it. But is that gonna change the balance of all these countries, how they can influence, if they got a better update? than the other?
Right, you're right. I mean, will Russia and China, for example, be able to get updates out? This is something I just heard the World Health Organization is now suggesting, because a lot of people in America, like me, have been sitting here saying, can we please get a booster shot? Why not? There seems to be a lot of it out there in the drugstores still. Can we please get a booster shot? Because we're concerned, But the World Health Organization told a lot of these countries like the United States, maybe don't rush into the boosters of the same vaccine, give that to Africa. What you should be doing is developing the next generation, next year's vaccine that will target the variants so that you're ready for that. That is what the United Nations is urging us to do. But of course, that's another whole big thing to develop. Hopefully, now that we've developed some options, you can tweak those rather than have to start over. That hopefully will make it easier. And we do an annual shot for the flu, and that's just pretty routine. So can we do something like that for COVID?
So following up a little bit on that, so if we develop a better update, then can we say, the countries that have been subscribing to China's go with us?
Right, it becomes competitive. You know what it reminds me of is like an arms race. It's like a vaccine arms race. Like, well, you developed this jet plane, well, I'm gonna develop this jet plane. Okay, well, your next generation is gonna be here, my next generation is gonna be there. It's gonna probably be the same with vaccines. Your first vaccine was here, but my first vaccine was here. Well, let's see what your second vaccine is. And it's probably gonna end up costing us some money, but see who comes out on top. We have some good resources in this country. We have some good, a good pharmaceutical industry. So hopefully we'll have a shot at it. So, yeah, thank you.
Well, Dr. Newnham,
Yeah.
thank you so much for being our presenter today. This was very informative for somebody that doesn't sit in this space all that often to hear about this. And I appreciate your perspectives. A special thank you to all of you joining us through the Zoom. When you log out, you'll be able to receive access to a survey. We appreciate you taking the time to do that. Please join us for future HOS colloquiums. They will be listed on the LionSide Chat website in the near future. And our next LionSide Chat will take place on October 11th during Common Hour, and that is the origins of culture. So be sure to come back and meet with other faculty, staff, and students to learn about all of the amazing things that is going on here at Penn State Berks. So until next time, this has been Penn State Berks LionSide Chats. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Done. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
I don't know if you need attendance credit, sir. If you want to, do you need to take it?
I'm gonna go 60, I bought it.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Just want to make sure you got proper credit for your attendance. Thank you so much.
Everybody else? Click
Everybody
in.
else should,
As long as we did this.
Yep.
Yep, as long as you did that, we'll make sure you get that to where it needs to be. Thank you. Nice job.
Yes, it was very interesting.
Yay.
Yep.
All right. Tech-wise, I think it all went well.
Yep.
Yeah,
There were,
we had lots of good questions.
Azar and Amir were in the chat, and I texted them both to make sure they could hear, so it was
Yeah.
good. I got a little nervous.